Hello malt mates, welcome to Ralphie Review at the Whisky Bothy. 1082 extras, extra perspective, extra opinion, extra stuff. And I'm going to give you some extra history here. It's not often that I delve into the underrepresented history of Scotch whisky, because the recent contemporary experts, to a certain extent, and this has been absorbed by the marketing teams, have sanitised the history of Scotch whisky and turned it into a narrative of cliches, of non-Scottish perceptions of what Scotch whisky is about. Now, I can understand it in the old days when immediate recognisable identity was important, and there was a very real threat to Scotch whisky in the early days, not just from the Irish whisky distilleries, of which there were hundreds, and they were producing better stuff, but also from an English whisky distillery industry, which was in fact distracted by making gin and providing gin and keeping up with the demand for the gin palaces all across London and other major English cities, in fact all across England. And so it was Scotland which actually got the chance, purely by default and by accident, for this thing called whisky, by which the definition was really it's blended whisky, primarily simple mixed mash bill, similar to bourbon, but lighter, in which you top up the flavour a little bit to give it a little bit of identity with these single malts that nobody particularly wants to drink. Now, this isn't particularly true. The whole reason why blends were dominated by the grain whisky was because it helped distilleries centralise control over brands and over the consistency of their product. In the early days, the production of malt whisky was inconsistent because it was quite a primitive affair. Now, that primitive affair has to a certain extent been retained by Springbank. So we value it, the local grain, the steeping, the malting, the kilning, the milling, the sparging, the fermentation, all the different steps of making whisky done at one location. It's an energy intensive and complex process which anybody can do, but not a lot can do right. So this is the reason that certainly, particularly in 1824, when the law was passed and the law was changed, making hooching and the production of liquor illegal unless you had a licence to produce, the first licence going to Glenlivet Distillery. It's well documented and it's quite a strong narrative, and it's one that's certainly been dipped into frequently by the Scotch whisky industry to deliver its heritage. But it wasn't as simple as that. And here I have a bottle of Loch Lomond Scotch whisky. And if you were to visit Loch Lomond Distillery now, which you can't, because it's a big industrial factory unit. It's not a glamorous place. But it was in fact founded on a farmland owned by a farmer who was producing grain for the distillers up Loch Lomond. And this is, I've got a map here. I'm going to bring the map round, and I'm going to bring one of my books out. It's one of my books, and by the way, if you've been buying my books, thank you very much. This is the second book, Stories from a Whisky Bar, and there's a chapter in this book. Let's see. Let's give you the chapter number. Hang about that. Got to sit here somewhere. Here we are. Chapter 8. The year is 1824. And this isn't long after the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain was bankrupted and the Bank of England, which held the national purse, was suddenly owned by a very powerful family, a European family, who cut a very long deal with the English monarchy to control the Bank of England, and it's still the same right now. And I'm not judging it, I'm observing it. It is what it is. It's good to see things the way they are, because the way they are is for a reason. And at this point, an awful lot of things changed quickly. People in Scotland were broken by that war. Those who returned as survivors, the soldiers, were often maimed and suffering from mental health disorders because of the trauma of the battlefield. And the society had to care for them as best it could. Many, as a result of their injuries, had to live in isolation and struggled to survive. And one of the ways that they could pay their rent to the local landowner, because back then all the land was owned by landowners, was to make liquor, and it would be white liquor. So although they couldn't pay money in the form of rent, they could do something of product to deliver in the form of rent. And therefore those who survived very, very quickly learned the best spot and the best technique and the best process for making the best quality whisky. The farmers, and this is where it becomes geographical, because as I mentioned to you, Loch Lomond Distillery, which is right at the most southern point of Loch Lomond. Things you need to know about Loch Lomond. Loch Lomond is Scotland's largest loch, inland loch, so it's cut off from the sea. It's got roughly about 23 islands in it, and although one side, the west side of the loch, because it's a very long, narrow loch, although it has a main road and is easily accessible, the east side of the loch has minor roads, and there's part of the loch completely impassable because of Loch Lomond, which is one of the highest mountains in Scotland. So this made Loch Lomond a perfect faraway place. Now, as you can see down here, right here, you've got Glasgow. Here is Loch Lomond. Now what you're seeing is only half of Loch Lomond. It continues further up to about where my hand is, the end of my hand. And I'm showing you in the map because it looks better than trying to show you in a computer. And I'm not going to start doing any editing, not now. I know you're still with me. So what you had was the farmers at the foot of the flat, fertile, silted part of the loch were able to produce really good quality grain, which the hoochers, because they couldn't hooch locally because it was too open, too many people, but boats would come down the loch from the remote areas and they would collect the grain and they would sail up the loch to Inverkip and Rowardennan and to coves further up the loch, where ponies would take the grain to their hidden distilleries, covered in moss, covered in heather so they couldn't be seen, and not a road for miles but plenty of water, always plenty of water. And along with the grain they would take wood. They would take clean burning wood that didn't produce a lot of smoke, and there they would turn the grain into hooch, into Uisge Bay, real Uisge Bay, white whisky. At which point they would come back down the loch in their boats with their finished product and sell it back to the farmers for a small reward. The farmers would then get in their horse and cart, and they would take, along with the milk and the cheese and the lamb and the beef, they would then go into the city of Glasgow and shift their whisky very quickly and get good money for it. Because even then, Glasgow was a centre of education, of religious establishment, and of very early empire commerce, post-Napoleonic commerce. Particularly at the beginning, the tobacco trade was beginning. The reason being that the Clyde estuary was, like Liverpool, a very deep port and well sheltered and suitable for the bigger ships. Glasgow's population was exploding. The demand for whisky was increasing. Sure, it was coming over from Ireland, easy peasy, but not enough of it was. So whisky was coming from all directions. At which point the authorities in 1824 decided they would impose taxation. Because after all, what are banks there for? The primary purpose of banks is to remove the wealth from the majority to deliver it to the minority. Don't kid yourself, otherwise it's just the way it is. And if that mechanism didn't work, they'd find another mechanism that did. End of. This is the real history of whisky. It wasn't just hobbies, and it just wasn't some quaint, genteel pastime by the peasants. It was a matter of putting food on the table for your families, and for many families it was the only option they had. And when taxation came in, ex-military were brought up, usually from England but often from round Edinburgh, Glasgow way, to enforce the taxation, and they did so with an awful lot of violence. This very rarely enters the narrative from Scotch whisky marketing and even the experts themselves. It has been conveniently airbrushed out of the history books. However, when you speak to the old families in the Loch Lomond area, at Drimmen, at Croftamy, round about these areas, down at Bon Hill, the traditional families, they have carried on verbally the legacy of the historical heritage, and that the troubles that occurred, the appalling treatment of locals by authorities who were acting purely as thugs and vigilantes to steal from the poor, and while they had the opportunity, with complete impunity, just beat them up. You've probably heard of the term hobbling. If you've ever seen the film Misery, great film to watch, the protagonist, the writer who's had a car crash, ends up being cared for by a very disturbed and demented individual who's an obsessive fan. And the way she keeps him confined to his bed when he's trying to escape is she puts a block of wood between his ankles and smashes his feet with a sledgehammer. Now, this is what happened in the old days to hoochers, to their oldest sons, right, to their oldest children. Why? To stop them, prevent them, and inhibit them from producing whisky to support their families, all because of the new taxation regime. Things haven't changed that much. They've just become, now in modern times, a little less physically violent and a little more opaque. But it is well worth deep diving on the authentic history, the full history, and not paraphrased segments which give glowing references for the modern globalist corporate multinationals in particular. This isn't specific to Scotch whisky. Rum's whole existence is enshrouded with violence and exploitation, as is not just in the Caribbean, far from it. Right up the east coast of the United States, a lot of rum was made, fortunes were made, and people were greatly impoverished. And in fact, alcohol overconsumption became such a problem that we have at the beginning of the 20th century the temperance movement, which were acting in the very best of intentions until they were basically taken over by the oil companies to shut down the distilleries, which, as well as producing alcohol for human consumption, were also producing alcohol for vehicle consumption. And if you want to know how efficient alcohol engines are, just watch NASCAR. And that, by the way, malt mates, is really all I have to say at the moment. I'm going to conclude with Loch Lomond here. Loch Lomond is absolutely typical of a lot of traditional and older Scotch whisky distilleries. It is located on the site of an original location where whisky was made because the product was found to be sweet in nature. But I look with concern that modern distilleries are being set up in areas of pure convenience, which do not have a sweet heritage to them, because the illicit distillers were not moving around finding the sweet spots, the lie of the land, the feng shui of the environment for producing the whisky. Mortlach is a classic example. Glengoyne is a classic example. Glenkinchie is a classic example. Edradour is a classic example. These locations are locations for a reason. The reason you have distilleries in very remote places is because they've been checked out and found to have provenance about them. And nowhere do you see this more eloquently understated than in Ardnamurchan. I rest my case. Malt mates, thank you for watching. I hope you found this entertaining and informative. I'll leave it at that. If you haven't subscribed, by the way, please do so, because if you ain't subscribed, you're not going to be informed when my next reviews are happening, are you? You don't want to miss them.